Ladies and gentlemen, it is with great pleasure I introduce to you Haribo, Golden Bear's Gummy Candy, 5 pound bag, and the greatest freaking review that has ever been done in the history of reviews. Shall we start? This comes from Jeffrey Lambert, reviewed in the United States on May 2nd, 2016. This is a cautionary tale. Unlike most of the other reviews on this product, this is a true story, and its authenticity can be qualified by a small news item that appeared in the Toronto Star's local news section during the month of April 2013, much to my chagrin. I would consider myself a prudent man, not given to bouts of unspokenness or craving attention, and certainly not one to rock the boat. On any given day, I can be found reading a crime novel on the park bench in the middle of the city, soaking in the opulence of nature while nibbling on my tuna fish sandwiches and fending off the voracious gulls and squirrels that threaten to spoil my repose. This is me, law-abiding and introspective, which is why it came as such a shock to me to find myself incarcerated because of the devil's confectionery, Satan's sweetheart, Lucifer's lozenges, the horror that is known as the Haribo sugar-free gummy bear. I like to set the scene. It was late winter, early spring in Toronto, and the city had just been digging itself out from a late-season snowstorm. I was heading to Pearson International Airport for the red-eye flight to Amsterdam in order to give the Dutch arm of our company some training in the new software that had been installed. I'm deliberately being vague to prevent my place of work from being linked in any way to the incident that occurred. I had just finished packing, checked the time, and found I was running late. My flight was at 7:10 p.m., and now it was almost 5 o'clock p.m. Cursing softly, I ran to the car, threw my bags in the trunk, hitting the gas a little harder than usual in my haste to make it to the long-term parking as soon as possible. Luckily, traffic was light on the 401, and I made it to the airport in record time, but knew that my chances of making the flight were still at risk if I didn't use my time wisely. I hadn't eaten since lunch, and I was feeling a bit hungry, my stomach rumbling loudly in protestation, which caused me to look around at the other travelers rushing past me in the busy terminal. Mortified that my bodily noises might be heard by others, I briskly checked my watch and decided that I had enough time to grab a quick snack before going through the baggage check and security. I would get something more substantial once I checked through security, so I spotted a vending machine nestled in a relatively low-traffic corner of the terminal and rushed over. Already pulling out my credit card and mentally assessing what I had been craving for so as to save time interacting with the machine. My eyes scanned the colorful array of confection and quickly coming to a rest on a tantalizing rainbow-colored bag of gummy bears with a simple white and red logo. Haribo, emblazoned across the bag in what appeared to be a slightly tweaked Helvetica rounded font. Now, I'd like to pause here in the story for a moment to underscore the importance of making proper choices. I was hungry. When you're hungry, you should eat food. Food is defined as a nutritious substance that people consume to maintain life. This is what food is. These days, the definition of the word food has been bastardized, and a meaning that has been broadened to include any material that can be digested or rather chewed or swallowed without causing death or severe illness. Haribo sugar-free gummy bears are not food. They aren't even from this planet. I imagine their origins being conceived in a boardroom in hell by a top team of creative pain administrators with senior-level demons rubbing their hands together in ghoulish delight as hell's chief chemist slowly lifts the veil on their new creation. The point here being, I made a very, very, very poor choice. I pushed the button on the vending machine, ejected the brightly colored bag into my awaiting hands. I had always liked gummy bears. They were bright, but rather innocuous. They weren't overly sweet, so as to become cloying, and of course, each candy came in the visage of a rather happy, docile bear, reminiscent of the picture of one's mind eye, holding all of the anthropomorphic bears from Yogi to Winnie. The way I figured it, I was taking a bit of a holiday from life so I could relax my fastidiously regimented daily schedule, just a little, to allow for some frivolity. After all, I was going to be in Amsterdam come morning. With 16 hours to kill, I had to be training the Dutch employees. Maybe I would take a trip down one of the coffee shops in the red light district and let my hair down. No, I wouldn't do that. I would see what area of the city from the bus as I went to the hotel, where I would eat at the hotel restaurant and drink a sparkling water. So I'd better enjoy the gummy bears, my one extravagance, to commemorate my break from routine. I joined the queue in the KLM line, which was mercifully short, most likely because all of the passengers for my flight had already been checked through as the flight was scheduled to depart in just an hour. I checked my watch again. Frowned, I absent-mindedly opened the bag of Haribo sugar-free gummy bears to begin to munch on them as the line slowly advanced. To be fair, they tasted fine, just like every other manufacturer's brand of colorful candy. They were sugar-free to boot, which is what made the whole incident that followed so baffling. If they had tasted off or different, I most likely wouldn't have continued to shovel them into my mouth absent-mindedly while daydreaming about what I would eat from room service in my hotel in Amsterdam. As I gave the attendant my e-ticket, she weighed my bags, and the first of the pains began in my stomach. I thought of nothing at first, chalking up to the fact that I needed something more substantial than gummy bears to tackle my hunger. But over the course of the next 5 minutes, the shooting pain began to come in more rapid succession. At this point, I had my boarding pass printed, and rubbing my stomach just a little, I proceeded through security. I briefly entertained the thought of trying to find a restroom before going through security, but at that point, my discomfort was manageable. I didn't think it would get much worse. Certainly not within the amount of time it would take to clear security. I joined the line and I started fishing for my passport to present to the agent checking tickets. I felt a thin sheen of sweat break out on my forehead and underarms, and my features flushed for a moment as a wave of heat washed over me. I didn't pay it much heed, as going through security always caused me great anxiety, and I chalked it up to pre-flight jitters. It was only as I stood face to face with the agent and handed her my passport and ticket that I had a glimpse of the agony that was about to begin. I felt time rippled for a moment, as if my consciousness buckled, so intense was the pain that fired through my bowels. I grimaced spastically and emitted a low moan. Oh. I felt myself taking an involuntary step sideways. Stars shot through my head briefly, and my vision blurred, and then snapped back into focus. The agent was staring at me with slight consternation and asked me if I was all right. So I pulled myself together, stood up straight, and declared that I was fine, mortified that I had a lapse of decorum not only in public, but at the security clearance in an airport. As I fumbled off my belt to go through the metal detector, the pain in my stomach increased, and I practically had to sit on the floor to take my shoes off, terrified of what would happen if I bent in the middle to do it. I was becoming increasingly more evident to me that it wasn't just a stomach ache. No, this was something much, much worse. As a child, I had a bout of diarrhea after a trip to Mexico with my family. I remember the feeling of nausea that swept through me before my child self had surrendered to the gas pains and parked myself on the toilet for an hour, shitting until I felt as if I didn't have any bones left. And that was how I was feeling now, with several key differences. The pain was worse. The sense of an impending bowel movement was so formidable it gave me temporary amnesia, and it took all of my willpower, all of it, to clench my butt cheeks together to prevent my sphincter from exploding. A sudden shock of pain racked my body. I had half wondered if I was going to give birth to a Tasmanian devil. The crazy, fever-induced image of said cartoon animal chasing Bugs Bunny through the splashy, volcanic shit kettle that was my stomach caused me to elicit a short, maniacal bark of laughter. As I approached the metal detector, a wild, distant look in my eyes. Sweat now beginning to pour off me like a long-distance runner in Kenya. The security agent on the other side of the detector shot a quick glance over at a coworker, who narrowed his eyes and made subtle movements toward his holster. My breathing became uneven. As I entered the metal detector, I realized with alarm that I had taken off my socks without even registering it, and one of my shirt tails was untucked in the front. I held my breath, my eyes bulging dangerously from my head as the machine scanned me. I shakily moved forwards towards the agent for a pat-down. My stomach began to elicit sounds that can only be described as otherworldly. It started off as a short bubbling sound heard from afar, and grew in pitch and intensity at an alarming rate. My jaw dropped in shock as what I can only describe as the sound of an agonized wailing alley cat in heat with a persistent Doppler effect added to its voice emitted from some nether region of my intestines. This officer's eyes widened in alarm. She kept her eyes glued to my stomach as she thoroughly patted me down. As she reached for my shins, I felt my innards suddenly expand and plummet towards my rectum. With cat-like reflexes, I squeezed my sphincter shut, and what seemed like nanoseconds to spare, I knew that if I didn't get to the bathroom immediately, I would shit myself. With a Herculean effort and all of the strength that I could muster, I forced my butt cheeks together, knowing that one false move would open the floodgates. I began to walk like a duck, trying to remain as inconspicuous as possible, not even caring what the other people were seeing in front of them. A disheveled, barefoot, 40-year-old businessman, red-faced, bulgy-eyed, sweating profusely, shaking slightly and walking without bending his knees. With single-minded intensity, I grabbed my carry-on shoes and socks from the plastic tub that passed the X-ray inspection station without putting anything back on. I turned on my heels with the intention of finding the nearest restroom and slowly dying there, one squirt at a time. But no, that's not what happened. I turned to go and found myself staring at 3 armed agents who stopped me and asked if I would follow them. Why? What's the matter? I stammered, wincing slightly as the act of speech seemed to strain the tenuous and extremely fragile truce I negotiated between my bowels and the tempest that raged within. I have to go to the bathroom. Right now, I pleaded. Just follow us, please, they said, leaving no room for argument. The other travelers clearing the security checks stared with curiosity and revulsion at the spectacle unfolding before them, whispering amongst themselves and hurrying to pack up their belongings to get as far away from me as possible. No doubt, assuming that the airport had nabbed some sort of a domestic terrorist. If I hadn't been feverishly trying to hold back the eruption of Mount Vesuvius, I likely would have died of shame. With each step I took towards the room they ushered me into, I felt that my legs would give way. I marveled at how strong the human will could be, marveled at what was essentially patching a hole in the Hoover Dam with bubblegum that could be sustained indefinitely. Maybe I would make it through this ordeal after all. The room they brought me into was an examination room. I had pretty much stopped registering the details of my environment as my consciousness closed off all but absolutely necessary functions. Breathing, and the ability to walk. But I snapped back to reality when I heard the snap of rubber. The slow dawning of realization poked through my agony as stoic resolve. I turned face at an agent, drawing rubber gloves. "Sir, we're going to have to perform a cavity search on you," a young, fresh-faced agent stated in a firm but emotionless voice. His short-cropped blonde hair was immaculate, and for a crazy moment I wondered if he was an actor, and this was some sort of elaborate practical joke to amuse bored kids watching YouTube. He must have taken my tortured silence for resistance, because he looked at me and said, "Lower your pants and underwear, please, and face the desk." Panic started to grip me in its icy grasp. Then the sudden adrenaline threatened to destroy my sphincter's bulwarks and rend my anus in two. I inhaled sharply, and with a pained gasp, I doubled my efforts to clench my cheeks together. "Sir, please!" I begged, deferring to this kid in the act of desperation. "I have to go to the bathroom. You can follow me in the stall if you need, but I had some bad Haribo sugar-free gummy bears, and now I feel like—" But they had stopped listening and smirked at each other. 2 of the other agents, a tall, dark female and a shorter, balding fat man, looked away from me, and I could see them shaking a little as they stifled their laughs. "Sir, face the wall. Put your hands on the desk and spread your cheeks," the young agent stated. a lopsided grin on his face. "But," I began to protest, and then a fresh shock of pain forced me to stop and lean on the table for support as an ungodly howling arose from my stomach. Something between the dying moans of a woolly mammoth and the sound of bubble wrap popping underwater. I exhaled shakily, and my focus began to narrow. As I rallied for the final battle, shaking uncontrollably and sweat literally raining down on the tabletop in front of me, I turned to face the wall and heard a meek, childlike voice pleading from somewhere in the room. "Please," it said, and then again, "Please," from somewhere within me. My mind recognized that this sound had issued from me, although my consciousness had now begun to separate from my body. I held my breath, and I prayed to God for strength. He probably has some heroin up there that opened up," the female guard said, as a part of me that hadn't escaped into the ether yet acknowledged that she was behind me to my left. "Probably high as a kite. Look at him." The shorter guard agreed with a snort off to my right. "Spread your cheeks," the young agent said, his voice directly behind me and lower than the other two. "And bend over. Please God, 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 please God," I whispered, a desperate, maniacal mantra. Not even aware of my surroundings anymore, I felt like I was lost in an opium fog, with half-snatched images and sounds filtering through a crate, a nonsensical version of reality. Another volley of pain tore through me, and I involuntarily leaned forward over the desk. My focus completely narrowed now to a spot on the wall, 2 feet in front of me, a cautious imperfection of what seemed to be whitewashed stone wall. It was a dark blotch, about 5 millimeters long, shaped like a smiling bear. A yellow, dancing bear. No, a green bear. No, red. No, it was all of the colors of the rainbow. My God, it was beautiful. I just took something as simple as a slight breeze to trigger Armageddon. That's all. No trumpets, no fanfare, no fire raining from the heavens, no dogs and cats living together in harmony, no finger on the button, no prophet who predicted, no nothing. As I stared at the rainbow bear smiling and dancing in front of me, my mouth agape, drooling, eyes glazed, bloodshot face, coated with a sheen of sweat, I heard the softest sound, an exhalation from the young agent behind me. And then at the same instant, the warm air of his fresh breath feather across my butt cheeks. For a moment, maybe less, maybe a split second, even a nanosecond, I felt the presence of God there with me, in that room. As neurons began to misfire at a blinding rate, nerve ending bristled and the muscles twitched reflexively, I stood on the brink with one foot hovering over the edge. And then, without taking my step, a single step, I found myself plummeting. With a sound like an extra-large plastic ketchup bottle being run over by a Mack truck, my sphincter released. The pressure of the blast pushed me hard into the desk, and the legs of the dress screeched as they scraped across the floor. My body remained rigid for a moment as I experienced a relief that could only be described as orgasmic in its purity. My eyes rolled back in my head and my tongue lolled out the side of my head. Like a half-retarded dog, I emitted a low, sustained groan. Oh! That grew in pitch as the filthy torrent pushed its way out of my body. Tremors racked my body, and it must have looked like a fish out of water with an endless stream of shit firing out of its ass. Other sounds and sensations started to filter now as my consciousness began to materialize once more. The muffled scream of a dungeon filled with prisoners near death radiated from my stomach. The rushing sound of liters of liquid trying to escape through an aperture too small to accommodate it all at the same time. The omnipresent sound of chunky liquid spattering against a hard surface with great force. The high-pitched screaming of a woman's voice calling out to God. Another voice sobbing uncontrollably, imploring me to make it stop. And my own ecstatic, monotone wail. When my own ordeal had eventually run its course, I was left panting for breath and wobbly-legged, half crying, half laughing with relief, barely lucid, and feeling as if I had birthed an elephant. My colon felt like someone had poured chili sauce all over it, then sent in a colony of fire ants to eat it. Through my sobs, I heard the sound of dripping, like when wet sprinklers are eventually turned off after an office fire. After a thunderstorm, when the willow that overhangs a pond continues to rain down long after the sky has stopped. From behind me, the sobbing continued, and I heard someone trying to speak into a walkie-talkie, but nonsensical words were all that the man could speak, which sounded like the ravings of a lunatic. Well, with great relief, I slowly pulled myself off the table, legs trembling, stomach eliciting one last, a loud, prolonged gasp bubbling that eerily resembled an orgasm. Slowly, I turned my head to survey the devastation, and in that instant, if I had a pencil or some other sharp object, I probably would have gouged my eyes out in revulsion. And the smell! The smell was enough to drive a man insane. It was the stench of rotting potatoes mixed with sulfur and ammonia, cooked in a broth of chicken shit and left to age for 2 weeks in a yeasty stew at the bottom of a French hooker. After the whiff of goulash brine, I immediately stopped breathing through my nose, and the taste was to remain in the back of my throat for months to come. The young agent. He had taken the brunt of the foul witch's brew. At first, I couldn't process what I was seeing. I thought somehow the young blonde kid had been spirited away and replaced by a brown Golan, or an ATV rider that had spent the better part of a day driving through every mud puddle he could find after a torrential downpour. With some degree of compartmentalization, I came to understand that for some unfathomable reason, this kid hadn't moved, or hadn't been able to move, through the entire fecal deluge. He had weathered the entire assault head-on like some hero from Greek mythology. I had given this poor schmuck one-man shit bukkake that would make a Brazilian pornographer retch with disgust. And he was still in the same position. In fact, he must have been from the moment of first impact. I tried to comprehend how he must be feeling, what he must be going through psychologically. But it became evident very quickly that he'd become very broken. No doubt forced so deeply within himself once the firehouse had been turned on that there was no hope of him ever coming back from it. Certainly not without extensive psychotherapy or even a lobotomy. I looked behind his quivering, catatonic, crouched form to see a perfect outline of him, cut out in the white wall behind him, either side filled with a dripping, opaque layer of alternatively pulpy and runny fecal stew. I noticed 2 quivering masses at either extremes of the room and realized they were in humanoid form. Although the caterwauling was coming from these broken creatures was just blubbering gibberish, I knew this was the tableau that was burnt into my mind's eye for eternity. Needless to say, I missed my flight. In fact, the next week is a bit of a blur. I have vague recollections of an army of hazmat-clad figures looming through the brown landscape of a soiled room. The slopping sounds of rubber boats squelching in puddles of fetid detritus, uncontrollable wailing and animal-like sounds issuing from the mouths of creatures that had been traumatized beyond their capacity for being put back together. This was complete loss of sensation from my waist down as I was rolled through the room on a waterproof gurney, its wheels struggling to surf on top of the shit-soaked floor. I spent a week or so in the hospital enclosed in a well-ventilated sealed room, with a suited doctor coming in on the hour to monitor my vital signs. As they tried to rehydrate my body, I'd apparently expelled every available drop of water from my body that was possible to sustain life without a short period of time. All of my clothes were incinerated in the hospital's crematorium, and the soiled bag of Haribo sugar-free gummy bears was never recovered. This is my story. It's inconceivable to think that this kind of product can be sold legally and be misrepresented as food. I was lucky I survived. But for the families of the survivors and the survivors themselves, they will forever live with the trauma of the events that took place at Pearson International Airport on that snowy day of April 2013.